Well, welcome everybody. So tonight we're going to introduce the new toolkit that we've developed relating to the assessment of wildlife value on road verges. And this is part of the County Council's Urban Road Verge Biodiversity Project, which is all about getting extra wildlife value out of road verges and encouraging local people to take some steps in trying to improve the biodiversity value of these verges. The project's been running now for about 3 years, and each year new verges are added. The partnership is between the County Council, NatureSpot, who is providing support for training and for survey work, but also with individual parish councils who are invited to come forward with ideas for verges in their area that could potentially be improved, and an assessment process then follows just to kind of get approval for that. So what we've done in terms of developing this tool is to try and answer the kind of key question is, well, how valuable is an individual verge for wildlife? But at the same time, and crucially, we've tried to build in factors that you can consider to help improve the biodiversity value of that verge. So let's move on to thinking a little bit about what verges are and what we can do and how they do relate to wildlife. So I think the first thing is to think of verges as potential wildflower meadows. They're not just, bits of inert green strips along the highway. They are living ecological habitats. Now, obviously, when they are mown, then the value of that habitat is low, and we'll come on to that in a few minutes. Mown grass doesn't have a lot of value for wildlife, and it's kind of important because Britain has lost so much of its traditional wildflower grassland. The hay meadows that were kind of widespread at one point have largely disappeared, been replaced by different farming practices, creating silage, etc. And so it's a bit concerning, but at the same time, it's quite encouraging that we have on our doorsteps the opportunity to do something about it, to kind of put more wildflower grassland habitat into play. And actually, it's very easy. All we have to do is to stop mowing them. And within a very short period of time, the wildflowers and the grasses that are there will start to grow and do their thing. They'll start to flower. So even within a week or two, some flowers will start to bloom. And indeed, a few flowers, daisies are one example, they've kind of evolved to be able to flower even when the ground is heavily grazed. And so they flower very quickly on very short stalks, and they can actually survive, therefore, the flowering under the mower blades. And there's one or two other plants like that. But give them a bit of a break from mowing, and then they start to become into bloom in more profusion. And you don't have to wait much longer after that before all manner of other flowers start to appear. It is actually amazing how many plants are just basically lying dormant in most verge grassland areas. Within 2 months, you can get a pretty attractive and diverse meadow. So tonight we're going to kind of look at this theme of thinking of verges as ecological habitats, and to think of them as living entities. Obviously, for wildlife to benefit, different species have different requirements. And although most people tend to think that the main advantage for wildlife of a meadow is that it will provide nectar sources for pollinators and bees, etc. That's only one of the benefits that accrue to wildlife from developing a wildflower meadow. Obviously, it does provide food to visiting insects, but also there's an awful lot of insects that eat the vegetation, the grasses and the leaves of the plants and so on. And they will also benefit if you basically allow the verge to grow. And the diversity of insects that you'll find within the verge far outnumbers those that will visit it just to feed on the nectar. So as well as providing food, crucially, just the structure of longer grass provides shelter and cover. Obviously, if you're a small insect, you're vulnerable to being predated. And so what you really want to do is to be able to hide away. And longer verges give you that cover to do that. But crucially, a lot of invertebrates are very vulnerable to drying out, and they require a moist environment in which to live. So if you ever kind of dig down to the base of long grass or a meadow that's been allowed to grow, it's surprising, even on a hot day, how moist it is at the base. Basically, it's protected from drying out by all the vegetation above. And that is crucial to so many species. So that moisture is really important. Obviously, when it's mown, the sun can get right down to the earth and dry everything out, and all of those species can't survive in that kind of desert-like environment. And of course, it's no good just providing food for visiting wildlife. You've got to provide the opportunity for them to breed if there's going to be a population next year as well. And so again, that just thicker structure, as well as the variety of plants that are there, do provide lots of breeding opportunities for a wide range of species. So our verges are actually wildlife habitats. What has been surprising, perhaps, in the surveys that we've done of the verges that have joined the scheme so far is the discovery of how many different species of wildflower and grasses are already there. Typically, we're finding between 20 and 50, sometimes more, species of wildflower and grasses in the verges. And as we said, these will provide a nectar source to the temporary visitors, butterflies, bees, flies, moths, all sorts of different flying insects that will come in. But as we said, they crucially provide lots of opportunities for wildlife to live permanently within the verge. And this is a factor we need to consider when it comes to management. How do we look after the wildlife that counts that verge as home and hasn't just visited it on odd occasions for a top-up of food? And structurally, also, it's important to think of verges as kind of as corridors where wildlife can travel from one site to another undercover, basically. They can link up, hedges and other areas. They obviously, by their very nature, verges are kind of linear features. And if enough of them is allowed to grow, or there's a nice natural element to it, then they do provide very important natural corridors. So staying with this ecological theme, let's just consider for a minute all the different factors that will affect what that habitat is and the species, therefore, that can live there. Some of them we're going to come back to in more detail. And I've just kind of highlighted some of those influences here. We can't, in the toolkit, consider every possibility of what could impact on the quality of the habitat, but we will pick out the most important ones and look at those in a bit more detail. So let's just think about the aim of the project. Now, from the County Council and, of course, NatureSpot's point of view, the aim is to improve the verge for wildlife. And I hope that's your aim too. There are a few people that have come along with verges that really want to kind of garden them. That is, just make them look pretty for people and aren't really considering the implications for wildlife. And so that's partly what we've tried to address in this toolkit, is to make it very clear what the existing wildlife value is, but as I've said right at the beginning, point out what you can do to improve it for wildlife. So we need to think about what is it that affects the wildlife value of the Verge. Well, we've hinted at some of those ecological factors. So we've picked out 6 different factors that all make a difference really to how important that Verge is for biodiversity. And we'll run through these and I'll just explain the thinking behind them and how the scoring will work. And then later on, I'll point you to where you can find a copy of the toolkit. It's free to download and hopefully fairly easy to use. And then at the end of the filling in the toolkit, you will kind of take the scores from each of those factors and multiply them together and come out with a single final score, and that will give you an idea of how important that Verge is for wildlife. So we're going to start with plant diversity. I mean, this is really the core of the toolkit. It all starts with what you've got there already, and then we'll look at the additional influences that come to play. So as a general rule, then the more plant species you have, the better. And this is because it basically provides lots more opportunities for different species of invertebrates. So many different species are specialist feeders. Yes, there are a range of flying insects, particularly that will just feed on nectar, and some actually prefer certain nectar sources, certain types of flowers. Others are more generalistic feeders, but most of them will breed, and indeed many other species will only feed on specific plant species. So you can take any one of our wildflowers and you can make a list of all of the wildlife species that are associated with that species. So it kind of logically ensues then that the more plant species you have there, the more different invertebrate species you can attract. And if you think of the kind of food chain, the more food you can provide and the more types of food you can provide at the bottom of the food chain, the more consumers you can support, and therefore that means there's more to feed the predators and so on up the food chain. So yes, people tend to think of wildlife as the more obvious species, the birds, some of the larger mammals, hedgehogs and so on, but they're only there because they are able to feed on the elements of the food chain lower down the system, the invertebrates, the insects, and so on. And they in turn require a rich habitat, such as a diverse wildflower meadow. It's also interesting just to think about what the Verge is doing in other ways. I mean, it brings a benefit to humans. Basically it's an oxygen factory. All of those plants are photosynthesizing and they are releasing oxygen. And if you allow them to grow, there's basically more leaves at play, and therefore they're producing more oxygen. Also, interestingly, the plants themselves are interacting. They're competing with each other. In some cases, they are parasitizing each other. So the whole thing is a living system. Plants aren't just, static objects that are just there to either look pretty or to be eaten. They're living creatures in their own right. However, having said all of that, if we are aiming to create a sustainable wildflower meadow, a permanent habitat that will be able to kind of go on into the future, then we need to perhaps recognize that some species are more desirable than others. And so when we come to looking at the toolkit, there are 2 types of plant that we are scoring. One is an overall score, how many species we've got in total, but then we're also giving extra scoring to a specific list of plants, what we're calling meadow quality plants. So these are the species that you would tend to find on a well-established, traditional and permanent wildflower meadow. So going forward, the more of these you've got, the further down the development you are in terms of creating your wildflower meadow. So when you get a hold of the toolkit, we've included in the appendix a list of all of the species that we consider in Leicestershire to be kind of meadow quality that you're likely to find on verges. This list has been based on all of the surveys that we've done over recent years of all of the verges. And we've done it in consultation with kind of experts in the field to try and fine tune and agree the list. Also, you'll note on the right hand side that we've given different scores to certain species. So this is again reflecting that some species are more rare than others, and like a harebell, for example, this one here, a beautiful kind of blue flower. It particularly grows in kind of acid grassland, so it's not likely to be a plant you'll find on every verge, but when you do find it, it means you've got a special verge. And so to recognize that, we give it extra points in the scoring system. The list is a lot longer than that you can see, but the full list of all the wildflowers and the grasses is in the toolkit in the appendix. So this is when you come to use the toolkit, what you'll see. The first section is about plant diversity. There are two scores. It's quite simple. What is the total number of different species that's found on the verge? And if you've got 28 species, you get 28 points. But then you have to look at those 28 species and compare them to the list that we just looked at in the appendix and add up the scores for each of those plants. And that will give you a second score, which you'll put in this box here, the score for quality meadow plants. Now, when you join the scheme, you will receive a survey by NatureSpot, and we will provide you with a report that lists all of the species that we found. And we will also then basically tell you the scores to put into the toolkit, not only the total number of species, but we'll also tell you what is the score from the quality meadow plants. So you can get a survey done by NatureSpot and then use that to fill in the toolkit, but you can have a go yourself. Obviously, you need to be able to kind of identify the different plants, but there's lots of help out there. And we've put a page in the appendix in the toolkit that will give you some pointers as to how to start identifying plants. NatureSpot is all about helping people to identify local wildlife. So there's lots of resources on the NatureSpot website, but there's also other sources of help out there that you could look to. So give it a go. So let's move on to the second factor that we're looking at, and this is basically the size of the verge. Now, it stands to reason that a larger verge is more habitat and therefore offers more opportunities for wildlife. So in terms of scoring the verge, we basically give more points or a multiplication factor for having a larger verge. And it's just worth bearing in mind that the width of the verge is quite critical, because the metre or so nearest to the highway is not so great for wildlife for a number of reasons. First of all, traffic trundling down the road causes air turbulence, and that affects flying insects, and it can either knock them out of the way, or it can actually suck them into the car's path or the vehicle's path, and you get a lot of collisions of insects along the verge side. Then also there's kind of winter salting of the roads, and a lot of that salt gets splashed onto the soil edge. So on salted roads, you'll notice that there is a different range of species along the verge. Plants that would normally actually thrive in coastal areas where they can cope with the salt have now found themselves a new home, a new habitat, where they have it to themselves, because most of our inland species can't grow when in salty soil, but the coastal species can. So in terms of creating a meadow, that strip isn't so great. And indeed, in any case, often up to a metre of the verge adjacent to the road can be mown as a visibility strip. This is a requirement by the county council to prevent the kind of longer grass falling onto the road, and to keep visibility down the highway nice and clear. So looking at the scoring, quite simply, remember we've got a score from the plant diversity, and let's say the score is 50, then that score can be inflated by having a bigger verge, or it will contract if you've got a smaller verge. So you just need to measure your verge, the length and the width. To do that, obviously you can go out and use a tape measure. It's just as easy and perfectly feasible to pace it out. So just stride along the 2 dimensions of the verge, count the strides, and roughly 1 stride equals 1 metre. But you can actually measure it without leaving the warmth of your home by using Google Earth, a free app that allows you to zoom in on the area, and it has a tool, a ruler tool, which you'll see right at the top of the screen. If you click on that, it allows you to draw a line, as I've done here, this yellow line, the length of the verge, which in this case is conveniently blocked out so we can see where it is, but you should be able to recognize it from the aerial photo, and it will tell you in this little pop-up how long it is, and you can do the same for the width. So moving on to number 3, the mowing regime. So this is something you're probably very aware of, that you need to stop mowing the verge during the growing season, basically. So that starts in April, and as different species will grow at different times, they have a kind of seasonal growth pattern. We need to stop mowing early to allow the spring flowers to grow, and not really mow until ideally till mid-September, to allow the kind of peak summer species to flower, and also for both of them to set seed, because we want them to kind of finish their life cycle, to drop their seed, so there is a thriving population there. Outside those times, it can be mown. It's or left. It's up to you. It's not critical. It's perfectly fine just to cut the verge once a year in around mid-September. It's not critical if you do it, even at the end of August or the end of September, sometime around then. But try and leave it until towards the end of August as a minimum. But then crucially, it is important to remove the cuttings. And there are 2 reasons for this. One is that if grass is just left on the verge, it kind of forms a kind of mat, and it cuts down on the light that reaches the vegetation beneath and basically smothers it. It stops it growing, and it also prevents germination because the new seedlings don't get any light, and they haven't got the resources to grow through the mat. So it's important that we don't leave the cuttings in place. But equally, what we're trying to do in nearly every verge is to reduce the soil fertility. Most of our wildflowers have evolved to grow in low fertile conditions, and our verges in the majority of cases are actually quite fertile places for a number of reasons. One is that the soil may be brought there. Secondly, there's a lot of nitrogen being deposited on land these days from the air, from agricultural drift of soil, topsoil that's blown up in the wind, and also kind of chemical additions. And also there is nitrification of the soil that takes place, particularly along highways, from that comes from the exhaust of vehicles. So kind of roll on electric cars, really, because that would help cut down on some of that additional nitrogen. And if you've got high soil fertility, it's going to affect the species that grow there, and we'll come to that in a minute. But also remember, we talked earlier about the species of invertebrates that live permanently within the verge. They're not just visiting it in the summer to feed on the flowers. What are they going to do if you cut the entire verge? So what we recommend is that part of the verge is left uncut each year, but you can alternate the part that is left uncut from year to year, such that every part of the verge gets cut as a minimum every 2 years. And that part that you leave uncut could be a third, could be a half. It's not critical, but it should be a good portion of it to provide a winter home for all of the creatures that have moved into your verge. So the scoring system for mowing works in a similar way to the previous factor. You've got your initial score from the plant numbers, and then you can inflate that score or reduce that score depending how you mow and what you do with the cuttings, as you can see there. So if it's going to be regularly mown, it reduces that score to a very low number because you basically destroyed the habitat. If you mow it annually but leave the cuttings in place, so you'll end up both getting the mats temporarily, and then as that mat decomposes, it's adding nutrients to the soil, so you're increasing the soil fertility over time, and that's going to reduce the diversity of species. So that's not great either. If you mow annually and remove the cuttings, that's great. But even better, and this will increase your score, is if you leave some of the verge unmown, and as we said, alternate that area each year. So just looking at the soil fertility issue, if there's high nutrients in the soil, it encourages certain species to proliferate, and in particular certain grasses that can dominate. And often these are either large grasses or very kind of robust patch forming grasses, and they basically take over. And in addition, you'll get some large flowers that can move in, thistles, cow parsley, docks, species that again that can grow above and smother the smaller wildflowers, and that will therefore reduce the diversity of plants that we've got. Whereas if we can achieve low fertility, it will limit the growth of these dominating plants, and in particular you'll get less grasses and you'll get more wildflowers. And as a lot of flowers are, different species are small, it will give them the opportunity to grow in the verge too. So yeah, these are some of the grasses that will take over if we don't address the fertility issues. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with these grasses intrinsically. They're all part of our native wildlife, and they do a good job at providing habitat. So even if you have just got these, don't think it's of no value. That's not the case. That structure that you are creating by just simply having tall vegetation is still playing an important role, but it's not going to give you the kind of colourful flowery meadow that we would like to see longer term, unless we can address the fertility issue and bring down the soil nutrients. So the next factor is kind of the structure of the verge habitat. Many verges are simply just a flat strip along the edge of the road, and that's fine. All of the factors we've looked at so far apply. But some verges have additional habitat features connected to them, such as a hedge or a ditch, and some of them are on a slope. And these can add additional interest because some species will only grow in certain conditions, and it gives the verge the chance to include those species in the diversity. So if you've got a hedge, yes, the hedge itself will provide additional habitat. You know, a native hedge, you know, it's got plants like hawthorn and blackthorn, hazel, and so on. They're really rich for a wide range of invertebrates in terms of what they support, and it provides physical cover for birds to nest in and so on. But also, as well as the hedge and the grassland, you kind of get this interesting, what's called an ecotone, this gradation from one habitat to another. So it's a semi-shade area at the base of the hedge, where some of the meadow species don't like it because it's too shady, but other species will prefer it, such as the ones we've got at the bottom, red campion, herb bennet, wild angelica. So they're kind of plants, additional plants that you can attract if you've got a hedge. There is, hang on, two sides to this though. You've got to be careful that if the hedge isn't managed, as this one is starting to do here in the picture, it's starting to grow over the verge, and that's not a good thing because it's casting shade. So the other feature that would be a good thing to have in the verge, or we should recognize if you've got it, is the hedge. Sorry, is the ditch. Often you get a ditch at the base of a hedge. The two often go hand in hand. And then these are some of the species that will grow in the damp soil that the ditch provides: ragged robin, cuckoo flower, meadowsweet, and there's a range of others, all again adding to the overall diversity. And the third factor, which I mentioned, is the slope. Now, a slope is interesting because as it rains, the rain will drain off the slope and it will leach out some of the nutrients, and it will help to reduce the soil fertility. So kind of a steeper the slope, often the richer the composition of the plants that you have there. So we're recognizing all of those three factors here. If you want to know how to recognize a native hedge as opposed to a non-native hedge, I'll point you to one of the ID leaflets we've got on NatureSpot, which is all about recognizing hedgerow species. But if you're familiar with the kind of traditional countryside hedge, then you probably see some of these familiar shrubs in a native hedge, such as hawthorn and so on. So the next factor is tree shade. And I suppose this could be hedge shade too, if the hedge isn't managed. Obviously, hedges can be a good thing for wildlife. Trees and hedges are a good thing for wildlife, but if they are casting too much shade over the grassland, they will be detrimental to the development of our meadow. And that's not something we want to see. The whole toolkit is designed to give you an indicator and a measure of the wildlife value of a grassland meadow, not of a woodland area or a hedge. So as you can see, this is one of the verges in the scheme. There are several trees growing across the verge, and it does cast quite a lot of shade, and it will, I'm afraid, prevent this grassland from ever really achieving the diversity that we'd want, because there are so few plants that will tolerate this level of shade. So in terms of the scoring, just try and make an estimate of how much of the verge is being shaded. You know, think like a bird. Think if you were flying over the top of the verge and looking down, how much of the verge would be covered by the canopy of the trees. And from that, you can see that the more shade there is, the greater that canopy cover, the lower the value of your overall score is going to be. If there's no shade at all, then great. It doesn't detract from the value. Now, our sixth and final factor is not really an ecological one. It's to do with community engagement. But if you think about it, we wouldn't have a verge providing any benefit to wildlife at all if there wasn't public support for it. One of the requirements for a verge to join the scheme is that a consultation exercise takes place with local residents and they have to be generally in support of it. So unless we can kind of keep that support and hopefully grow it, then that verge is vulnerable really to, you know, people that just want it mown or kept tidy in their view. And so what we're trying to do is to recognize that giving the verge a high public profile, giving it publicity, and indeed trying to encourage engagement with local residents is a really important thing in terms of keeping that verge going and building support for it. And it's also worth bearing in mind that these verges on the whole are relatively small. They're not massive areas of new habitat, but they play an important role being in our villages and towns in illustrating that we can do something to kind of reverse the loss of wildlife, and also to challenge this kind of outdated view really that every bit of grass has to be mown within an inch of its life. And quite simply, verges that are left unmown are more interesting. They have more to look at. They change continuously through the seasons, and of course they're doing this extra job for wildlife. So we're recognizing three things here. One is any event that's held on the verge. New verges will have the survey conducted by NatureSpot where local people are invited to come along, and that would count. But thereafter, the parish council can arrange their own annual event, maybe to do an annual survey involving local people. Also, many of the verges involve local people in doing the cutting and the removal of the cuttings in September. So that's another good way of encouraging engagement with local people. And then, of course, you know, publicising the fact that the verge is there, why it's being left unmown, either on the parish council website or in a community newspaper or on social news outlets. All of that will help. And then thirdly, NatureSpot will create a wild place feature page for every verge on the scheme. And that's another opportunity to draw attention to the verge. It's a place where we can explain what's going on, but crucially, all of the records of the plants, the grasses, and all the other wildlife that's spotted there will be listed on that page. And NatureSpot, by its nature, encourages the public to submit records of wildlife that they see to kind of build up the overall knowledge of what species we have and where they live and in what abundance. And these wild place pages are able to filter out all of those records that relate to that given site and feature them on that page. So it's a great way of local people contributing to the knowledge of their local verge. So the scoring for this again allows you to boost the overall score if you conduct some publicity. So to get hold of the toolkit, it's now available for download online. You go to the NatureSpot webpage and use this URL here, Verge Wildlife. Also, if you like, you could contact NatureSpot or Rosanna Burton at the County Council, and she will send you the link or a copy, whichever you prefer. So you've got really two choices as to how to fill it in. You can download the toolkit itself, and it's probably best to print it off and then just manually fill in the scores. On the right hand side there, you can see the final column where you can write in the scores, and then when you filled everything in, you multiply those scores together, and that will give you an overall number. To save you doing the maths yourself, if you like, as an optional extra, there is a spreadsheet version that you can also download, and you can just put the figures into that, and that will do the calculation for you. So what do the scores mean? Well, typically the scores will come out somewhere in the range between kind of 20 or so and 150 or more. The absolute score isn't telling you anything very specifically, it's just giving you a guide. it's an indicator that the higher the number, the better that verge is for wildlife. And so there's some guide here as to how you're doing. In most cases, the verge will start at the lower end of the scoring pathway, and with good management over a number of years, it will get better and better, and the score will go up. So it's quite interesting, I think, to go back each year and to see how it's doing, to perhaps do a new survey and see if we're collecting additional species that will eventually move in of their own accord. But I think more important than the score itself is to kind of understand the factors that we just run through as to how they impact on the wildlife benefit, and therefore the kind of good practice that you can adopt in managing and dealing with your verge. One of the questions that often comes up is, should you seed the verge? Should you artificially enhance the plant diversity? As a general rule, we say be wary of this. It's not necessary on most verges. You'll probably be surprised how many species you've already got there, if only you allow those plants to grow. Seed is expensive. It's time consuming to prepare the ground and to sow. And you may buy a seed mix with 20 species in it. Probably the majority of those won't survive. You probably won't even see many of them. They won't germinate. They provide you with a range of species for different circumstances. And also, even those that do germinate over time, depending what you've got in as the natural vegetation in your verge, some of the species you've introduced will get outcompeted. So as a general rule, we think it's best to work with what you've got. But if you are going to buy seed, make sure you just put in native species, and to go for seed that comes from a kind of a quality supplier. If you go onto the NatureSpot website, onto the Verge page, we give you a list of recommendations of where to get the seed. Please don't put any bulbs, and definitely no daffodils in there. Unfortunately, many people think daffodils are a good thing to do to enhance the verge. The daffodils you plant are not native. They don't provide really any benefit to wildlife, and quite the opposite. Once they finish flowering, the leaves spread out and create a bit of a mat on the ground and smother some of the plants that are trying to grow there. As Chris Packham sometimes calls them, naffodils. Also beware the seduction of cornfield annuals. They do look very colourful, I agree, but on the whole, they don't add a lot of wildlife value, and they only will give you a very, very brief splash of colour just for a few weeks in the first year after they're sown. They will not, on the whole, come back in the following year unless you completely obliterate the verge. They've evolved to grow on disturbed soil. That's why you see them on farmland, or used to do before herbicides have removed them. When the soil was ploughed, it would bring the seeds to the surface and they would germinate. But we don't want that on our verge. We want the verge to be kind of low maintenance and to naturally develop. Just one thought: an alternative to putting seed down is to buy some what are called plugs. These are small seedlings, which you can just create a little bit of space on the verge and put them in. Whatever you do, don't try and destroy what you've already got. If you're going to put seed or in plugs, just kind of rake back some of the existing vegetation, rake vigorously to create a bit of soil, but without destroying the roots of what's there. And then you can put the seed down or put your plugs in. And one other thought is, think about including yellow rattle if you're going to put seed down. Yellow rattle is an attractive plant in its own right, but it's a parasite of grasses. And the roots of yellow rattle will plug into the roots of nearby grasses, and it will basically suck out the nutrients from the grasses, and it will reduce the vigor of those grasses and stop them dominating. and that will help with the diversity of the wildflowers. So in summary, just try and work with the verge. If you're going to add additional seed or plugs, only do it to a limited area. Try not to do the whole verge, and don't try and spray out or dig the existing plants. It almost certainly won't work anyway. The reason those plants are there is because naturally they are suited to that ground. And so if you're introducing something artificially, chances are they are not so suited, and they will very quickly get replaced by the ones that were there already. So if you want to look at other sources of help, go to the Verge Wildlife page on NatureSpot, and there's a link there to a really interesting talk by a chap called Phil Sterling. He used to work for Dorset County Council and was in charge of their road verges there, often on a bigger scale than the ones that we're dealing with, but nevertheless, he has some great thoughts and explanations of how the verges were developed. We are also going to, in the next month or two, carry out verge surveys on all of the new verges. There's 14 new verges this year, and you're very welcome to come along to any of those that you can make it, and you can join in the survey and learn a little bit about and more about plant identification, and we will trial the toolkit on the day, so it's a way to kind of learn a little bit more. And similarly, over the next month or two, we're going to be running 4 training events where there's an online video presentation which you can watch at your own convenience, and then there are 4 site meetings where you can come along. There'll be a small group, and we will go and we'll be looking at wildflowers in one, grasses in another, hedgerows in a third one, and then general wildlife in the 4th. And if you'd like to develop your own skills of identifying wildflowers, grasses, and indeed any other wildlife, then look at the Appendix 2 in the toolkit. Gives you some links, some pointers as to how you might get on with that. So thanks very much for listening in, and if you come along to any of the meetings, I'll hope to see you there.